Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. I'm super excited to be talking with you today. I've got some pictures, some tips to give you, and of course, if you're watching live, Jessica is here as always, and she'll write those down and I'll address them at the end of the chat. So I'm gonna go over some tips on how to hopefully not get stuck while you're quilting, tell you about some new things that are coming up, and then just kind of recap the challenge that we talked about. Before I get to that though, no live chat next week. So those of you that have been on my live chats before know that next weekend is Quilt Walk. I have some long arm classes going, and next Thursday I will be busy teaching in our new long arm room. So no live chat next Thursday. The next one will be June 13th. Doesn't that seem really far away? It seems like crazy, but no, it's practically June right now. So it's just weird how fast time is flying by. In last week's live chat, I talked about the new Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along that's coming out, and that's going to start July 9th. That free video series, we're going to learn some different designs for common quilt blocks, and I think the website is finally back to normal. Y'all kind of crashed it last week, which I love. So for everybody that placed an order, thank you so much. I appreciate your support. You don't have to buy the products to quilt along with me. It's always free on my YouTube channel. But it's a good idea to probably go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you'll get notified when those videos come out. So here's the schedule, what we'll be working through. The videos will come out once a week. I'll be doing the live chats in between, and we're just gonna have a great old time chatting with each other, learning some new stuff, quilting along together. Here's just some examples of the blocks that we'll be working with. Log cabins, very, very commonly asked questions about those. We'll talk about snowballs, chevrons, and even curved blocks. So just some little examples to get you excited about the designs we're going to learn. And in all the videos, I show you how to quilt them on a sewing machine and do a little bit on a long arm too, so you can kind of see both ways. And those products I was talking about, they are still pre-order. So they're on a pre-order, but man, my staff is cutting like crazy to get those out, so they'll be shipping really soon. And if you haven't used your buy one, get one half off, then you can definitely still go ahead and do that. The link or all the information about this video series is in the description box below. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I did a whole half an hour about it last week. So again, really excited. Here at Quilting is My Therapy, we do about 2 of these free video challenge classes a year, and it's kind of like the big event. And it just so happened this one landed right before Quilt Walk. I don't know what I was thinking. There's been a lot of drinking here, but it's been fine. No, I'm just kidding. In fact, we were so busy announcing the new Free Motion Challenge, I didn't really get a chance to talk about our Long Arm Education Center open house. So we have a room full of beautiful long arms, and I'm going to get to teach hands-on long arm classes here at our event center whenever my heart desires. So I know that some of you watching, most of you watching, don't live in the area. I saw we had some viewers from Australia. Getting up at 5:30 in the morning, I don't know if I love anybody that much. I might do that for Jessica, but it would be hard to get up that early. I know not everybody lives in the Kansas City area, but if you do happen to have the ability, I have some fun events coming up. Now you can click the link in the description box below. It'll take you to all the classes, but I'm just gonna hit some of the highlights of those. We had an open house. You can kind of see the room there. It's so beautiful. I've been going in there and organizing all my thread and just, I don't know, enjoying it. But these are some of the first classes that have come out or that I've kind of put together. It's really weird being in a position to pick whatever class I want to teach, whatever format, however long. So I'm kind of doing a little bit of everything. I'll have a whole cloth class. That's going to be a 2-session class. Probably not worth flying in, but if you live in the area, definitely. And then I'm going to be doing a long arm boot camp. So this is like an in-depth 2-day class, everything you need to know about long arms. Now in our studio, we have Handy Quilter Amaras because I'm a Handy Quilter user and a Handy Quilter dealer. But the stuff that we'll learn in all these classes can be applied to any machine, so don't let that stop you. And then a machine quilting retreat. Now this is not long arm specific, but this was kind of came out of our last sewing retreat. Somebody came thinking it was a machine quilting retreat, so I thought that's actually a really good idea. So you can find all the information about that in the description box, all the upcoming events and classes. Again, I'm just kind of excited to see what takes off and what classes are popular, if any. We'll see. Okay, now we're getting to like the good stuff. If this is your first live chat or if you haven't watched any before, I always try to share something, some tip, some pointer, something to help your free motion quilting journey. And when I was finishing up a quilt for Tula the other day, I had an idea. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to take in progress pictures and kind of share how you can work through an area without getting stuck. Now I'm going to pause before we even get to the pictures because not every quilt is the same. Sometimes you're going to get stuck. Sometimes you're going to have to tie off. Sometimes it will take 3/4 of the quilt until you figure out how you're going to work through those blocks. The goal here is not for you to overthink this. It's just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're working through your quilt, and just know that there are ways, things that you can do that make it a little bit easier. Now, all the pictures of this quilt are pretty close up and tight just because, I'm just talking about the quilting, but I will do a live chat about the whole quilt with all the pictures at a later point. So anyway, so the first thing I want to talk about, when you are working through an area, have a plan. It's really hard to hit a target that you don't know. So anytime I'm working into an area, I want to see, where am I going? Where do I need to end up? And how can I do that? So this picture right here, you can kind of see I have the kind of quilting along the left. You can see that unquilted area. So my plan is to get in that area, quilt it, and get back out. That's really going to be a big influence on the designs that I use or how I approach it. Okay, so that's the first thing, kind of having the plan and having that idea. If you don't know, don't worry, just go for it. And I'm sure, you'll figure it out before too long. So in this example, I want to quilt that whole unquilted area and end up back where I was at. So I'm going to work my way to the furthest point and then work my way out. Now, when I teach classes or I see people that are struggling with this, we already kind of do this when we mop a floor or paint a room, right? When you go into your room, I don't mop a whole lot, but I do know how to mop. I don't go in there and just start mopping everywhere. No, I work from one side, leave myself an escape route so I can get out without making my floor dirty. So here I'm just kind of using the quilting to work my way back there. That's how I like to do it. Of course, this is just dependent on your preferences. I don't feel like you have to do it this way. Try not to cut yourself off. Knowing that I have to get into this area and back out means I need to have a little bit of an escape route. I need to have some unquilted area to work my way back through there. So here you can see an example of where I might have blocked my path. Again, if I find myself stuck, it's not the end of the world. I could tie off, embellish the quilting, do whatever I need to do, get out. So here you can see my escape route. I have that unquilted area so I can work my way back out. So this quilting is a little over the top, very dense. That's what I'm doing for Tula. But this applies to any meandering design that you might be working around something like a block or anything. So you can see here just pictures of me working my way through. You can kind of imagine me quilting, bebopping, listening to my music or my book until I get to the furthest point. Now I've reached that and it's time to work my way back out. Doing the same thing I've already done, right? Using the filler, here I'm just quilting some different designs together, some leaves and swirls and pebbles, and just filling in the gaps now as I work my way out. Somebody had a question in the type chat if I was going to share tips on how to combine designs, and I can do a whole separate live chat about that. When you're combining several designs, all you have to do is just use echoing to fill in any gaps. It's pretty, I don't want to say it's simple, but you quilt your swirl, you quilt a leaf, and then if you have any gaps in between those two, you use your echoing or another design to fill it in. So I'll probably do a live chat more about that specifically, but you could pretend I'm doing a meander here or some swirls or whatever. Again, it doesn't have to be over the top like this. And again, working my way out, filling it in, and then ending up now ready to go on to my next spot. Okay, another thing you can do is use traveling to get out. So that's a commonly asked question. Do I like stitching in the ditch, traveling along a seam? I do, and mostly because it helps me get around an area. So in this example, I'm quilting a swirl chain, no problem, but sometimes my quilting design will cut my area in two, and I have to use traveling to kind of work my way through there. So if you find yourself blocked or stuck, ask yourself, how can I get out? And do it. Maybe it's echoing, maybe it's traveling or quilting along that seam. So here you can see the design has ran into that block, and I'm going to fill in one side with more echoing and more details, but now I want to end up on the other side. So you can tell I'm kind of blocked. So what I'm going to do is travel around that block to get to the other side. I feel like there's some kind of joke there. Why did the quilter cross the seam? I don't know. So you can see here I'm going to just travel along that seam to get to where I need to go. Now, I do like stitching in the ditch, so I will stitch in the seam even if it's not a escape route, but it definitely here is helping me get out of there. You can see with the arrow, it's showing you where I was stitching on that seam. Sometimes I'm asked, how many times is too many times to stitch in the same spot? I'm just trying to guess the questions Jessica's writing down over there. It doesn't matter. You can stitch as many times as you want over the same spot. I try to keep it to 2 or less. Sometimes I'll do 3, but for the most part. So here you see I've traveled along that block, and now I've gotten to the other side so I can fill in that area. So use that traveling to get yourself out of an area if you want. Another thing, now this is a little more abstract. Again, it's not going to be every quilt, but on this particular quilt, there was this stem to a flower, and I knew those little pieces, that's fussy cut, that's a print. One of my favorite things to do on her quilts is to stitch on the lines of her stripes to make it look like she pieced it. But I also know that if I stitch along that line of the stripes, that can be my transition from one side to the other. You can see I've got some irregularly shaped areas here, and so to be able to hop back and forth, just using that design is really helpful. So sometimes looking at your designs and thinking, oh, is this one that can help me go from the border to the block or what have you? Again, I know it's not every time, but sometimes you can pick those designs that will help you move through an area. So let's look at this. I finished my swirl chain. It looks great. Now I'm going to add all that dense filler because I like to quilt things to death. And you can see my machine is up at the top. I want to fill in around that leaf. I actually want to also grab that unquilted area that's at the bottom that I missed before and then end up at the end of the swirl chain. Okay, so that's my plan. Again, it doesn't have to be like a big, long, drawn out thing. Just think, where am I going and how do I need to get there? So I'm going to start filling in my area, and as soon as I hit that stripe or that fabric, I'm going to use the stitching or that design that I've picked to get to the other side. Again, that's why I'm doing those kind of lines like this and maybe not a vertical echoing. Well, now that I've transitioned to the other side, I can fill it in and then use the same stitching along that print to get to the other side. So again, think about transitioning. How can I get in and out of these areas? That way you can not get stuck. So I filled in that area here, and then I'm going to stitch on over and then fill in the area there. Now this part I almost didn't put in, but I'm gonna try talk through it. Hopefully I don't make it more confusing than it is. In this example, I want to fill in that unquilted area, but I also want to stitch in the seam because I like how it looks. So if I get to the end of my area with my quilting and then stitch in my seam, I'm going to end up right back where I started, right? So knowing that, I want to try to not do that. So I'm going to try to do both and end up on the opposite side. Again, I think sometimes when I say this stuff out loud, I realize how maybe neurotic I am about quilting or how efficient I like to be, but it just kind of gives you a peek on what's in my head. So there I am at the bottom. I'm going to work my way to the swirl chain so that I can come back and stitch along the seam to get out. Again, this is not, required. You might be thinking that you don't love anybody enough to do this, and that's fine. But here you can see I've quilted up along that spine. I've left myself an escape route where that arrow is pointing. Those gaps are going to let me get back in there later when I need to get there. And then I worked my way to the swirl chain so I can then stitch my seam down and then come back and fill the space and be done. So again, it may be a little overkill, but working through a quilt when I can do it efficiently really helps me make the most use of my time. I know that, not everybody wants to be like me, super efficient, but I mean, our time is limited and I want to do the best quilting I can without taking the longest time. So again, I probably overthink those. So stitching in the seam to get back down and then filling it out and moving on. Most of the time I can work my way out. Most of the time I can figure it out. But I will say that it's just a personality thing. If you're the type of quilter that's like, you know what, I want to do all my swirl chains, I want to get that one done, and then I want to come add my filler, that's totally fine. The way I'm working through this particular quilt, because I am on a long arm here, is I want to handle all those areas while I'm there. I don't want to have to come back. So any gaps are filled in before I move on. So I'm doing some swirl chain, some filler, some of this and some of that. So again, you can kind of change this depending on your personality, but this is just kind of how I roll. And then now that I've filled in that area, I've stitched in the seam, I'm gonna use stitching along the ditch to get back to the other side and then continue on my merry quilting way. So again, take it for what it's worth. I'm interested to see what you guys think of all this. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm wondering how many of you are like, no, 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 and how many of you are like, oh yeah, that's what I do. So I've worked my way to the other side and now I can continue on. Again, I always love it when it works out the way I want it to. Does it always work out? Not always, but for the most part, sometimes I can get it to work. And there you can see the finished result. That's a really irregular area. I have my swirl chain, which needed to go in first. I had to bounce back and forth, but I was able to quilt it all without stopping or tying off. But since I am kind of going back and forth, I do like to stop every once in a while and just make sure I haven't missed a spot. Since I'm stitching on all those stripes, I want to make sure I didn't miss one because then it will look, pretty noticeable. So there's that. All right, the last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll answer your questions, is you can alternate between your designs if necessary. Again, this is just a personal thing. In this example, I want to stitch along the seam and fill in that gap. And if I do that, I'm going to end up right back where I was, and that's not what I want to do. I want to end up in the direction I'm heading. So I'm going to stitch in the seam a little bit and fill in a little bit, stitch in the seam a little bit and fill in a little bit. Just because that area is so small, I don't really have a lot of room to get in there and back out, if that makes sense. So you don't have to do all of one, then the other. You can break it up into sections. Now, that works perfectly for my mind. I have no problem starting a swirl, going into stitching in the ditch, and then coming back to it. Again, you're going to have to, adjust this as necessary. But here we can see I've stitched along the seam a couple inches, and then I'm going to fill in my area, come back to where I started or ended, and then continue on, doing a little bits of both so I can work my way through those smaller pieces. So fill it in, working my way to fill in all those gaps, using echoing. Echoing is your best quilting friend. Use it to fill in all those gaps, getting back to where you ended your stitching in the ditch, and then continuing on. So you can see here, that's my goal. That's where I'm working to. You can see my scissors and the arrow pointing to it in case there was a doubt, and then resume. So filled it in, stitching a little bit more, quilting a little bit more. So not only am I trying to fill in these gaps as I go, I'm treating them differently depending on their size. Bigger unquilted areas are going to be a little bit easier because I can have plenty of room to work my way back, but those smaller areas might be tricky. Of course, I could always leave out stitching in the ditch and make it so much easier on myself, but I like how it makes the block pop. So again, just a couple more steps, stitching in the ditch, and then adding the filler until I filled in the area. So I know that's kind of like, I was pulling all these pictures together and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're gonna think I'm crazy. But this is just how it works. This is how my brain works. And I'm sure it probably would have been easier to understand if there was a video, but it just kind of lets you see how I'm dealing with those areas. As you're working your way through a quilt, don't think of the whole thing, just think of the section you're working in, and that will be how you get through that whole quilt. Well, do we have any questions about that? Oh, Jessica, she's like writing them down. Lots of questions. Awesome. Would I recommend the same thread color or contrasting color for a first timer making an artsy type quilt, or just a piece of fabric to work on different motifs? It depends. You knew that was going to be my answer. So thread color is truly subjective. It is 100% what you think. Now, for a first-time quilter, if you're like, I just want it to be pretty, I don't want to, I don't want to make any mistakes, then maybe a thread color that matches the fabric would be a good option. It's harder to see. And in fact, I forgot to mention this, that quilting right there is white thread. It's like linen, little, like just barely off white on white fabric. So it's kind of hard to see the quilting, which is why I'm getting that nice textured look there. So, but if that was maybe a quilt where I wanted the swirl chain to really stand out, then I could have used a contrasting thread color. It totally just depends. I think, if as far as the fabric goes, like if you're just wanting to practice and try some different things, load a piece of fabric, grab a busy panel and fill in the areas, or get a piece of solid fabric and say, I'm going to quilt this whole thing in, and then see how it looks when I'm done. Okay, do I worry about the density being the same throughout the quilt? I do not. But there is a caveat there. I'm not a show quilter, so don't do what I suggest and expect to win a ribbon. And for the most part, my quilting is pretty consistent. It's dense. It's dense everywhere. And even my swirl chains, or the elements in that quilt that were less dense to pop out, there's not a big discrepancy. It's about a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch difference. So in that example, from the most dense to least dense, there's not a huge range. But again, that's just subjective. Some people worry about that because they think the quilt won't lay flat when they're done. And the truth of the matter is, if you quilt it densely, that quilt might not lay flat when you're done anyway. So if that's the case, you can block it or get it wet and lay it flat. So I don't worry about that as far as that goes. When I'm thinking about density of quilting, it's how much do I want this thing to show up? So I quilted the swirl chain. I had these swirl chains that kind of look like they're coming from the flowers. I wanted them to stand out, especially with the white thread, since I was using white thread. So I quilted the filler around it more densely. That's about as deep as I get with the density there. Have I quilted a quilt on the long arm and then realized I missed a spot? What do you do? Yeah, that is always a special kind of torture, don't you think? It's amazing when you notice. I have taken a quilt off the frame and noticed right away. It makes me so mad. If that's the case, I do a really down and dirty loading job just to get it on there so I can quilt it. But I have quilted quilts for people for their quilt market booth and not realize I missed a spot until it was hanging on the wall. So you could reload it, you can go back and fill it in, but it's always a special kind of torture when you realize like, oh, hey, look at that, I totally missed it. Machine quilting, is that quilting with my domestic sewing machine? Yes. So machine quilting just means that we are moving the fabric, if you're on a sewing machine, or moving the long arm, if you're using that type of machine, and you are kind of using the thread and moving in a free form motion. Basically, your feed dogs are not pulling the fabric. Your hands are now guiding it. And that's where it gets a little scary, but it's so much fun. So if you haven't tried it, I hope you will. How would I quilt a 1-block wonder quilt? My gut tells me edge to edge, but I would like to explore custom designs. It depends. Come on, I mean, I thought it was too easy, but it's true. What kind of fabric is that 1-block wonder quilt made from? Most times, 1-block wonders, if it's the one I'm thinking of, it's like a cut into pieces and rotated to make these cool secondary designs. That bold, busy fabric, you're not going to see the quilting anyway. So I would quilt around some of the elements or try some new, designs, free motion fillers around there. It's also a great time, though, to explore custom designs because since you won't see the quilting as much, they're going to kind of hide if you're not happy with it. Back in the day when I'd quilt for customers and somebody would say, I'm giving you a trial run, which always made me like, geez, that's nerve-wracking. But then they'd give me something like that, a 1-block wonder, and I'm like, well, you can't see my quilting anyway. Last time we signed up for the challenge. Do we need to do that for this new free motion challenge? Nope, that was a little too much. It was, people were like, oh, I didn't get an email, everything's going on. No signing up. If you are on my YouTube channel, you'll get an alert. Go to my website. You can sign up for our email newsletter, and I'll be sending that out. But it's not like you won't get it. So hope that helps. Which batting should we use for this challenge? You want recommendations for non-iron types. So they know I like the fusible batting. As long as it's a quality batting, that's the most important thing. If you're quilting on your sewing machine, I would go with a little bit lower loft so you're not dealing with that puffiness. But Quilter's Dream Poly Select is my favorite non-fusible batting. Polyester, and then Select is just the loft. Again, as long as it's quality, you'll be fine. So you can kind of play around with that. Good questions. How do you get used to the limits of the space on the long arm, like the throat space? It is, well, first of all, I'm used to it because that's how I started machine quilting, was on a long arm. How you approach that quilt on the long arm is so different than a sewing machine. I'm thinking very linear, like in rows, whereas a sewing machine, I can wind and go wherever I want. How I'm going to approach that quilt is going to be totally different. And we will see this. When I do go through the details of this quilt and you can see the progress pictures, I'll say this, but it'll be hard to explain. Since I'm on a long arm, those long verticals, I'm not going to do one long feather this way because I have to advance too much. So those swirl chains kind of run off the edge and then they come back and then they go behind a block. I could say it's artistic, but what it's doing is giving me transitions and adjusting. You can get similar effects. You just have to be able to know how to adjust your designs. And it doesn't take long to get through that. It only takes about once or twice of trying to do diagonal lines over a whole quilt before you realize that's no fun on a long arm. So you kind of get used to changing the designs or tweaking them to make it more efficient. Can you tell me a little bit about the perks of being in the Long Army, specifically the business mentoring? So we are handy quilter retailers, and I knew that when we started doing that, when we opened our shop, gosh, like 9 years ago, isn't that crazy? That I wanted to be a handy quilter dealer. And I'm so passionate about our aftercare, our after sales training and service. So the Long Army is what we call our owners, and they get I'll say perks. They get special treatment because they've invested in my business. So we have monthly owners meetings through Zoom. We're going to have them in person too. I also do a monthly business mentoring thing, and that's really because I love talking about the business stuff. So those sessions are free, plus you get training. You can come to any class, any event. So it's really fun way, and then it's like a community. Sometimes I feel like, gosh, they're all my customers, but they're all like some of my best friends are in the Long Army. So it's a great time. If you're looking for a machine specifically and you have questions, you can always reach out to us and we'll answer your questions in a non-pushy, salesy way. So I do love my Long Army. What's my favorite stitch length? I like it long. I don't use a stitch regulator, so my stitch length is organic. I mean, you can actually, if you look real close to those pictures, you'll see maybe my pebbles are small and my swirls have a little bit longer stitch length. So if you need like a suggestion, if you're like, oh, tell me a rule, Angela, to follow, I'll say 10 to 12 stitches per inch would be a good range. Questions about the gloves you're wearing. Why are those better with the fingers out? Just curious. They're a little bit lighter. They don't make my hands as warm. I think they're sexier. And also they kind of let your ring kind of not smash down. They're not quite as grippy as like machiners. So if you want full on grip, that's going to be the better option. But really this is not a perk that's going to help most people. But when I'm filming, I can pop it off the fingers. It's still on my wrist, do the camera stuff I need to do, and then put it on real easy. So that kind of helps. All right, can I quilt a quilt on both a long arm and a sit down? Yep, you can use either machine. You can even use them both if you have them both. So if you wanted to base your quilt sandwich, quilt some of it on a sewing machine, you could technically load it on a long arm. So hopefully that helps. Great questions. These are some great questions. Well, I do appreciate you all hanging out with me on Thursday at 3 p.m. Central. Again, I won't be here next week because I'll be teaching classes at my new education center, but we'll be back June 13th. And I don't know what to talk about yet, but surely it'll be something good. And then they'll be pretty soon. We'll be heading into the challenge in the video series. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Stay safe and happy